what are your thoughts about outgrowing relationships, right? How can people do this sort of with integrity?
I often feel like when we're talking about this, there are two approaches to this. The first one I call the light switch approach. There's two switches, right? It's on or off. And a relationship is either you're in it to win it, it's totally good, or you flip the switch off and you're cutting it off because it's not aligned with your highest self and it doesn't bring you total peace and alignment. And I think that approach can totally be helpful and reasonable, especially in cases of abuse, manipulation, really active toxicity. And sometimes that could be a sign of emotional cutoff, like not doing the emotional labor required to make a relationship work. So the other metaphor I like to use is the soundboard approach. You ever go to like a concert and you see the sound guy in the back? We can treat our relationships like that with all these different parameters that we can adjust.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of the Terri Cole Show. I'm super excited about this interview that I'm sharing with you. I interviewed Hailey Magee, that's her name on Instagram, which is basically how I found her. And she, like me, is very much obsessed with helping people learn all about boundaries. And in this interview, we talk quite a bit about the nuances of boundary setting, especially when social media sort of wants it to be like, this is right and this is wrong. That's not necessarily when you're really teaching it how it actually is. She came to this work because of her own experiences, same like me. And she's actually a certified coach, an educator, and a writer. And I really love her work and feel like she has an original perspective on a lot of things. So I hope that you learn something about boundaries, about outgrowing relationships, about self advocacy, because those are all the things that we talked about in this interview with Hailey Magee, as much as I enjoyed interviewing her. I'm so excited to welcome Hailey Magee to the Terri Cole Show. Welcome, Hailey.
Thanks for having me, Terry. Excited to be here.
Me too, since we're both mutually obsessed with boundaries. We have a lot in common, which is kind of how I found you actually, was on Instagram. So I want to start by asking you, how did you get interested to the degree that you are in teaching people about boundaries?
Well, I think probably like so many folks who do similar work to what we do, it started personally and became professional. So I know for me, there was sort of this seismic breakup I went through that alerted me to my own like codependency and boundary, difficulty setting boundaries and asserting myself. It was only in the aftermath of that relationship falling apart where I realized, oh my God, I like completely lost my sense of self in that. Didn't know how to set limits and overgave like out the wazoo. This was years ago, but that sort of lit the ember. It was like the fire starter for my learning and then eventually becoming certified as a coach and doing that whole thing. So, and I find that's pretty common, I think, because there are a lot of like wounded healers, right? Like folks who go through something personal and now just trying to help others do the same.
Yes, but with the wounded healer moniker, that usually refers to people who are still wounded and bleeding all over their clients. So we're not going to say wounded healers. We're going to say in our own healing process, right? It became so exciting. We wanted to share with others because, of course, what you said, of course, is obviously true. Why are we drawn to this work? 98% of the people who do anything when it comes to the mental wellness or relational space, it's because of our own pain. And we're really hoping to help other people be in less pain, correct?
No doubt about it. Absolutely. And like we get it so viscerally, right? It's like, no, we really get it. So,
I'm not just
yeah.
imagining, I really get it. In doing what you do, you and I had a conversation offline sort of about social media and about sort of our own experiences in negotiating social media. So what do you find sort of the most taxing if you want to get into it? Like I'm into whatever. I mean, I'm
Oh,
into talking about all the things.
I'm so here for it. Well, this is so interesting to me because it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately and talking with other, for lack of a less annoying word, like influencers about is really this concept of a lot of us, ironically, like a lot of us spreading like mental health related messages on social media, I find tend to grapple with like social media taking up too big a presence in our own lives. And I'll speak for myself instead of the whole. I know for me, that's been a big issue. It can feel addictive and compulsive at times because I so desperately want to help other people and spread the word, but then there's no denying that on social media, it's designed to be addictive and give you that little ego stroke and,
Mhm.
keep you captive. So I think it's something that a lot of folks who have big followings don't talk about at length because it's vulnerable to say that, I think.
Mhm.
And it sounds like you've really, in many ways, got it down pat for yourself, though, those social media boundaries, you could say.
Well, I would say that it's over lots of years. Like, I'm older than you and I've been doing it longer than you. And so certainly in the beginning, it was it was something I talked about in my own therapy about how not I don't want to be sucked into this. And the same way, you're a coach doing this stuff, I'm a psychotherapist doing this stuff. It's like the same way having poor boundaries with your clients doesn't help your clients. Overgiving to your clients, not establishing transparent rules of engagement in your practice, right? That was me, of course, in the way beginning of my practice because I was such a friggin' boundary disaster. But it took me having a really amazing therapist slash supervisor who really made me see the value of boundaries and how you actually cannot be a stellar therapist and have disordered boundaries with your clients. Like, that's my side of the street to figure out. And so I feel like I applied the same thing that I learned about that in my practice to social media. Be so clear with either what the directive is. If people, because obviously with the number of people we have following us, I cannot personally answer every person's question. I don't even have a private practice like that anymore. So we would have more canned responses that get back to people saying, hey, Terry answers millions of questions publicly, but you need to ask it publicly. You don't have to say your name, but it's got to benefit, no offense, more than just you. So I do monthly lives, ask it there, or just ask it underneath a post if you have a question. You don't have to give me 17 paragraphs of backstory. Like, I promise you, if you give me like 4 lines, I can probably give you some good advice and I'm happy to do that. But I think that that was the beginning of realizing there had to be a limit to the amount of bandwidth I was willing to spend on social media in that way. And it's very difficult when you are a natural healer, when you're a helper. I'm a therapist. If someone's in pain. So, of course, I will have people going through the direct messages to make sure that no one really needs a recommend. I mean, I hope that someone who is really in crisis is not DMing me and waiting 4 weeks for someone to get back to them. But, we're always looking. Like, my team is very trauma informed, crisis informed. We all are. So that's a self protective thing and just something that's natural you do as I do as a therapist. But I think that let's go to the other thing you're talking about. Now, I'm talking about the boundaries to protect the other people and to protect myself, right? Having boundaries. Like, this is how you can get your question answered, giving people information. Now, actually speaking to the thing you're really talking about, which is how does it affect us
Mm-hmm.
personally? And how do you not fall into that sort of tech hole? It's impossible to say. If you have something exciting going on and you post something that's exciting or something's going viral, there's no way you're not going to know that. But what do you put in place for yourself now? Do you have boundaries around your social media use?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you just said resonated. And I think an additional aspect, when you were just saying, what does it do for us or what does it make us feel? I actually think it's not so dissimilar because like I talk a lot about boundaries in the context of people pleasing, which is like not a diagnostic term, it's a behavior, right? Sort of putting
Mhm.
others first to the detriment of oneself. And it's a sense of validation craving. And there's no denying that the same behavior can show up in social media when you have this platform where, at the click of a button, you're just getting that external validation. And so I think for me, a big part of the like boundary setting process around social media has been really taking stock of how much I lose. What's everything I lose when I'm interacting with this compulsively? Like sitting
Mm.
down with my journal and really making a list, everything from being fully present with my partner on the couch to, if I'm checking Instagram, walking down the street and there's a beautiful sunset here in Seattle beaming off the trees, like I'm not seeing that. And those losses, they add up. And for me, that has been the most incentivizing to set some clear guidelines around it. It's hard
I
though. I
love
still
that.
struggle with it. I'm not like healed by any means. I grapple with it daily.
But I love the looking at it from the point of view of what am I not getting to experience? I would always say to my therapy clients who if they were really feeling like they were like tech addicted or just spending too much time or complaining about the partner, whatever it is that what I notice is that if we are trying to live life, but really we're half engaged with life and half engaged with our phone for whatever the reason, think about it's like life light, where things don't have the same impression, feelings don't have the same depth. You're not fully present. I recently went away with my sister and I noticed that she was on, even though we were at a place that was like no phones, and I was talking to her and there were different moments where she would like look down to be on her phone and I would stop talking. And it's not even like a control thing. It's like a thing that I'm positive I deserve 100% of your attention.
Right. Right. Why would I speak up if I know if it's not landing, you're not really listening? I do the same thing. There's no
Like
point.
no, it's also though like an agreement. Like in my relationship with my husband, we've been together 25 years. We have we have like rules of engagement around this, like no phones at the table. If we're together, we're not unless there's something important, you're waiting for something that's important, let's say, and it's timely. All right, that's a different story, but that's not 98% of life. That's not what's happening. It's just checking out of boredom or checking because we want that dopamine hit. And there is something to be lost in that. So I think for anyone who's watching this on YouTube or listening to this on the podcast, really think about like this is an invitation. Hailey Magee and I are inviting you to do an inventory of your own use, the truth. Are you numbing your feelings? And hey, we're both admitting like we're not, no one is above this. This is very compelling. It is very compelling to have people liking and commenting and feeling, especially if you have a certain mission and people what you wrote really is hitting with people and they're saying, oh, I feel better or this helped. I mean, when you're like an addicted helper, nothing makes you feel better than that, right?
Absolutely. And it is shocking when you really sit down, and it's like what you were saying about life light, like what you shine the spotlight of your attention on grows all the time. So like every time we can just slowly catch ourselves and rewrite that habit, and it's a practice, but I don't know, man. We got to reclaim our attention somehow. I mean, I don't know if you've read the book Stolen Focus.
Mm-mm.
Um, by I think you pronounce his name Johan Hari, but
Hmm.
great book about this concept. Highly recommend. Maybe we can pop it in the show notes too.
Yes, I think we can. All right, let's talk a little bit about nuance in boundary setting
Oh my God,
because
can we
that's
please?
yes, because that's a lot of what you talk about. So let's talk about it. Tell me.
Yeah. Let's well, I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Terry, because I think, this actually is a great segue because social media really lends itself to like pithy, short, sweet, and uncomplicated hot takes. Right. And I think that at times it can be really challenging to incorporate nuance or find nuance on social media because in the beginning, when we're learning how to set boundaries and like break the people pleasing pattern, it's like, at least in my experience, you're just like craving permission from someone to speak up for yourself and be authentic. You are just like thirsty in the desert, right?
Hmm.
So you crave those really simple hot takes. But then I've found that like over the years, the more comfortable I've been doing this work personally and professionally, there's a craving for like information and advice about boundaries that both gives you permission to advocate for yourself, but doesn't discount the murky gray area of like, what if our boundaries do hurt others? Can we help somebody after we set a boundary? Things like that.
Oh, it's so good because this is one of the things that in having a public platform and an online platform, that over the many years I've been doing this, I've learned quite a bit about. I know what people are going to say. I know that there's going to be people who are going to misunderstand what I'm saying. They're like, "Oh, so you're just telling me to reject everyone outright." I'm like, "Yeah, that's my advice. That's exactly what I'm saying. Reject everyone outright." Uh-huh. So I feel like I set it up. And I'll also say this does not apply to, and I'm not talking about minor children. And I'm not, like I try to get clear, But I also am really well aware of the limitations of the complex nature of what I teach about and what I talk about. Social media has limitations, which is why all of us teach courses, have communities. We create sacred spaces where we can dive more deeply. One major reason I have a podcast for the past 7 years is because I want to be able to dive into those nuances and feel like I have been fully self expressed, because there's nothing more frustrating than having something to say, but feeling like you can't fully say it. So, again, I think that what you're talking about with the nuance is people really want it to be black and white. And they're like, yeah, just do that. I'm like, except in these 17 cases, like, that's not the way it is, right?
Totally. And I think it's very human to crave simple answers to complex problems. And what's interesting, what I found is for a while, I really avoided sharing those more nuanced takes because like the algorithm won't prioritize these, people won't like them. But what I found when I started sharing more of the content that really dove into the nuance was that
Mm.
people were like, yes, like finally someone's not living in the black and white. And there are plenty of people who do this. But I think it's almost like we need to give our audiences a little more credit and take the risk of being nuanced because that's the information people need. Like, I think this comes up a lot as it relates to deciding whether or not to maintain friendships or partnerships, right? The idea of
Mhm.
just cut them out if they don't contribute to your sense of overall peace versus knowing like how much of that is ours to hold, how much may I improve my skills of emotional regulation and conflict resolution in order to
Mhm.
make a relationship more sustainable? Just one
Mhm.
big example I see a lot on there.
That's actually a great example, because there's a desire to sort of blame and have it be black and white. And people are always asking me questions like, so how can I set boundaries with my entire super dysfunctional extended family and ruffle no feathers? I'm like, P.S., you can't. So
Right.
that's just, I, someone else might have that answer for you. I do not. People will notice when you start drawing boundaries. But again, I always look at the question and what someone is asking tells me what they fear, right? That person is afraid to rock the boat. And then I speak to that, which I do understand. But I think there's something about, I do trust my audience. And I have to say, they're really smart. So many of them have done a ton of therapy and done their work. And so I have faith. Like, I don't need to, I can be super clear, but I do have faith that people are probably going to get what I'm saying. And then if they don't, like, I just did something on, I was on a Lisa Bilyeu's show. I was out in LA on Women of Impact, and it was amazing. And she picked this clip that she shared, and zillions of people saw it. And it's like literally 37 seconds out of an hour and 40-minute interview. And so you have all of these people responding like, I don't think that's good advice. And I don't like the way, maybe it's out of context. I was like, yeah, it's out of context. And yet there must be the part of me that goes, whoever wants to listen to the entire interview, which was wonderful, can. I'm not going to respond to every person who didn't and explain, oh, it's out of context because blah, blah, blah. Like,
Right.
I think that there has to be a part of us that goes, some people are just going to misunderstand us.
That's the boundary. Therein lies the boundary, right? It's like we have these meta opportunities to practice what we preach every day. And that's such a good example of it. And I
Yes.
think something you said really struck me. You spoke about the hypothetical example of the person saying, oh, I want to set boundaries, but I don't want to ruffle feathers. And I think this is one area of nuance that I'm most passionate about in my own work. And I work with people a lot on is the idea of growing pains as it relates to our boundary setting and just really acknowledging that like in this work we're changing the status quo, we're breaking old patterns, decades long, generations long often. And so like loneliness, grief, heartache, resentment, guilt, like these are all absolutely par for the course. And frankly, I've never met a single boundary setter who was like, oh yeah, it was like totally effortless, no bad vibes. It's like it's hard.
No bad vibes. Exactly.
Yeah.
So do you see different stages?
Actually, I think oftentimes I do, and I'm curious for you too. Like, I think a lot about Kubler Ross's stages of grief actually. Like I was just writing about this in an article, but so often we witness those same stages of grief as we ourselves let go of parts of our identity. So releasing the people pleaser part. Or also, maybe releasing relationships with people with whom we really are no longer aligned. Or even like grieving for our younger selves who didn't feel safe and didn't feel like they could say no. I often find there are stages of like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Like you see all of that stuff cycle through.
Agreed. Same. And you have to allow yourself to go through it. And I think that that's so much of the time with the social media stuff, people kind of want a quick fix. And what I always say is it's not quick. Like if I had a magic bullet, dude, I'd be loaded. You know what I mean? If I knew the one thing you needed to do to become a boundary boss, I wouldn't have written a whole book, right?
Right.
So
One post could have done
allowing
it.
ourselves. Yeah, exactly. Just that would be it. I would be doing something else for a living. But I think there's something about being in acceptance that it takes time. And it's interesting in the course that I teach, it's like a 2-month course, and people will get so impatient, like I just am so mad that, I'm stepping back into old behavior. And I'm like, dude, it took you like 5 decades of this old behavior. You've had literally 5 weeks of the new information. Like, be gentle with yourself, celebrate every win, allow yourself to feel the sadness of, because I think you're right, there's a certain amount of grief that we really have to experience if we're going to change the way we interact in our relationships. What are your thoughts about outgrowing relationships, right? How can people do this sort of with integrity?
Oh, well, if I had to compress into a bite sized idea, I think I teach this in my outgrowing relationships workshop. But I often feel like when we're talking about this, there are two approaches to this. The first one I call the light switch approach, which I think social media really glorifies. So at least classic light switches, not nowadays with the hyper modern stuff, but there's two switches, right? It's on or off. And a relationship is either you're in it to win it, it's totally good, or you flip the switch off and you're cutting it off because it's not aligned with your highest self and it doesn't bring you total peace and alignment, right? There's that sort of narrative. And I think that approach can totally be helpful and reasonable, especially in cases of abuse, manipulation, really active toxicity. And sometimes that could be a sign of emotional cutoff, like not doing the emotional labor required to make a relationship work. So the other metaphor I like to use is the soundboard approach. You ever go to like a concert and you see the sound guy in the back, like twiddling those diddles or whatever
Mhm.
in the back? We can treat our relationships like that with all these different parameters that we can adjust. So like maybe this relationship, maybe seeing your very intense, wonderful friend 5 times a week is not working for you. So you mess with the dials, right? You pull back time spent, you pull back frequency of interactions or length of interactions. You adjust your expectations for what that relationship is or could become. And there's a lot of wiggle room there that I think we often don't like tend to in the stages of outgrowing.
Yeah, I think that's very true. The all in or all out thing, it doesn't mean that those two extremes don't exist and are not valuable, as you said, right? Sometimes you do have to be all out. Sometimes a breakup, if you're disengaging, blocking altogether does make sense. At least I say that with my clients, like at least for the first 6 months, so you can both move on. You're not ruminating about what they're doing, but you can do it as an agreement and not as a punishment, right? There's a way to actually do it where you're like, if we want to successfully move on, perhaps this is the way that we should do it. But I do think that there's so much gradation in the middle. And I would have talk about this, especially with female relationships. Female friendships are real complicated, right?
Mm.
Sometimes they're more complicated than romantic relationships, right? If it's just platonic friendship. And I would have women come up to me after me giving a talk on boundaries somewhere and being like, I have a friend and I have to break up with her. Like, I have to, the relationship has become so toxic and blah, blah, blah. And I would inevitably say, okay, so have you had a conversation? And they would inevitably say no. And I'm like, okay, before we torch the entire village, which maybe torching is in order, I don't know, but saying nothing, having no conversation because you're afraid, right? That whole cutoff, of course, is a disordered emotional boundary. Obviously, it's being too rigid. If you are like, I'm having a conflict and now I just have to end it. But I'm all like,
Exactly.
I have an idea. How about a conversation and see? You might be pleasantly surprised and maybe not. We can always cut off, right? It's hard to, like, once you do it though, it's hard to undo, you know?
That's right. And I love that idea of like that, nuclear option. It's always there for us should we need it. But until
Right.
then, right, like making those adjustments can really help. And I personally went through this within the course of the last 2 years. I had a friendship, maybe like the people who hear you talk, right? It was like it just didn't feel right. It felt very heavy. But because my own anxiety at the idea of having an extended conversation about it was so intense, cutoff seemed like the best option. And I did that. And then looking back, having the clarity of mind nearly 2 years later, it's easy to see how, wow, I was just in a really reactive place because the thought of having this hard conversation and risking being disliked or being in the wrong was so potent. A more moderated approach, I think, can really help sometimes. And that requires us to be comfortable having boundaries. It all comes back.
Or it requires us to be willing to be uncomfortable,
Yes.
right? Because you know what, dude?
Yes.
Are we going to be comfortable? Even now, I wrote a whole book on it. And still, is it my most favorite thing to like have a confrontation with someone where I need to set a limit or disappoint someone when I know they want something from me? Not my most favorite thing.
Mm-mm.
But it's like you get to a certain point, and I wonder if you feel this way in your work, where in my own evolution, I got to a certain point where I couldn't not take the right action. I could no longer act like it wasn't happening. All the ways, all the psychological defense mechanisms I used to use to avoid having that conversation. I got to a point in my own mental wellness where it was right here. Like I had to have the conversation. And usually I would just want to do it right away. Whatever conversation, if I need to let that person know right away is what I want to do. Where in the past, I would make them wrong. I would be like, they're entitled. Like there was all these ways you can twist it up so you can simply avoid having a conversation you feel ill equipped to have.
That's right. Totally resonates. Oh my God. And I love that. Like, I love the fact now in my life that being straying too far from my center of what feels true, it is intolerable. Like it's gotten to a point where if I catch myself exactly like you said, like projecting or blaming or, even in my own self, disobeying my internal boundaries with compulsive social media or doing anything addictively, like I feel the tension. I know what's true for me. I know what's right for me. And so I immediately am like, how do I bring this back? And that's such a gift because I think when we're really disconnected from ourselves, like way back in the people pleasing days or whatever, what is true for us or what is right for us feels so freaking murky. It's like,
Mhm.
I don't know. Who am I? What are my values? Like, that's just like a swamp to sift through. But now it's like clear as day. It is such a gift.
Oh my God, it changes your life because when you think about it, when you're in the throes of the people pleasing in that compulsive, and many people watching or listening might be there right now. For me, all I wanted was for there not to be a problem. Like my highest value was let's just avoid conflict, please. Let's
Oh
just,
my God.
if there's something I can do to fix your problem, I was the auto fixer, the auto accommodator, all the things. Because the thing that I wanted to avoid the most was the conflict that I felt like I had no skills to handle. And what gets lost when we're living that way is that, well, people don't friggin' know you because you know that's not who you are. That's just behavior so that you can avoid being uncomfortable. But I think that in the process of evolving in the way of boundaries, people come to realize that, hey man, you're really not that fragile. And neither are your relationships, you know?
Heck yeah. We learn our own resiliency and we become less lonely. Like I think in the people pleasing, right? Other people don't know you. You don't know you. And you might be surrounded with people you have these like genial relationships with, but there's no substance because they don't know the true you, needs, grievances, and all.
Hmm.
And that's the wild thing is like in our boundary settings, certainly some relationships might not be able to withstand our boundaries. But
Hmm.
those that do, we feel such a greater sense of belonging and being seen in them. And it's even if there's fewer people, the quality is so much richer now.
Yep. Totally agree. All right. I have a question for you personally.
Yeah.
What has been your most challenging boundary struggle and how have you overcome it?
I'm thinking about like three of my heavy hitters. I think I'll just, keep it simple and say the first major boundary I set was with my parents. And basically, I had reached a point in my own like therapy where I was coming to terms with a lot of the dysfunction that occurred in my childhood and in my family. And I needed to break some patterns around I was a parentified child. I was an
Mhm.
overgiver in some of those dynamics, and I needed to break that. And there was some dysfunction without sharing too much. There was some dysfunction that no one was addressing, so it kind of fell on me to address. And so, after much thought, I kind of wrote my parents each a letter depicting where I was at and what conclusions I'd come to and what I needed, and I sent them along, and it started a series, and it's never a one-time deal. Usually it started a series of complicated conversations with each of them where I sort of unpacked old hurts and talked about what I needed now. I mean, it was terrifying. I say it calmly, but like, I mean, I felt so sick during it. My stomach was always hurting. There was this existential feeling of like, am I going to ostracize myself from these two people who raised me and who I love very much? And it was the
Mhm.
hardest. And it took those relationships maybe a year and a half or so to find a new equilibrium where I felt comfortable again. So that's normal as heck, too, for those listening, the sort of relational instability that follows a boundary. But it doesn't mean the relationship's over. It can just mean you're finding a new normal. So that was the hardest. That was 5 or 6 years ago now. And I don't regret it. It was very important for me.
That's amazing. I love that share because it's also amazing that you gave your parents credit for being flexible enough, even though you didn't know if they were going to be flexible enough to hear you or to be able to come up with like the new homeostasis or whatever.
Yeah.
And I love what you shared about it does take time to find the new normal. Like, what is going to be the new way that we interact? When does it become comfortable? Because, if you were changing the way you were interacting with your folks, that's uncomfortable because you're not doing, I always look at it like a dance. So, like, you're changing your dance steps. And of course, they're going to be like, wait, what's going on? What is happening? And they kind of want to kick you in the shin and be like, hey, man, I do this. Now you do this. This is our dance. And it's so tempting when someone is trying to, Dr. Harriet Lerner talks about people doing a change back move. Yeah, I know.
Yes.
She's brilliant, right? Like just the best. But I think of it that way, like on the dance floor where like you're doing something new and they're like, no, no, no. They're trying to just get you back into the vibe of what it was or the way that the old behavior was. And it does take a certain amount of willingness to be uncomfortable during what I call the in between.
Mm, 110%. Yes. Couldn't agree more. And it was Dr. Harriet Lerner's book, The Dance of Intimacy, that gave me the tools I needed to set that boundary. So she was like the queen for me, like the first entry point. So she's the best.
I love her so much. All right, so tell us, where can we find you?
So you can find me. My website's a good, one-stop shop, HaileyMagee.com, Magee. And my Instagram is a place where I'm posting daily reminders, advice, and little comedic reels. So at Hailey Page Magee.
Which is where I found you. I love your Instagram. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I really appreciate you, Hailey Page McGee.
Thanks for having me, Terry. This was rad. Thank you.